My name is Marcus Thompson, and I'm lying in this hospital bed, struggling to breathe. The oxygen mask feels heavy against my face, but not as heavy as the weight I've carried for 38 years. The doctor's words echo in my mind like a death sentence: stage 2 diabetes, severe sleep apnea, congestive heart failure, and your BMI is 47. Numbers that represent a lifetime of choices, each one leading me further down this dark path. The fluorescent lights above seem too bright, too harsh, illuminating the reality I've spent decades avoiding. This sterile room has become my confessional, where I must finally face the truth about what I've done to myself. Every breath is a battle now. My chest rises and falls with mechanical precision, assisted by machines that hum and beep around me. The nurses speak in hushed tones, their eyes filled with a mixture of professional concern and something else I recognize too well: pity. My wife Sarah sits beside me, her hand trembling as she holds mine. She hasn't said much since the ambulance brought me here 3 days ago, but her tears speak volumes. The silence between us is heavy with unspoken fears and the weight of years we might not have together. The cardiologist mentioned surgery, but my body might not survive the procedure. At 420 pounds, I've become a prisoner of my own flesh, trapped inside a body that's betraying me with every heartbeat. The irony isn't lost on me: the very thing I use for comfort, food, has become my executioner. As I drift in and out of consciousness, memories flood back like a movie reel of a life lived in the shadows of shame. Each recollection carries the taste of regret, bitter and overwhelming. The monitors continue their relentless symphony, counting down moments I may not have. Sarah squeezes my hand, and I know what she's thinking. We both wonder if this is where my story ends, in this sterile room surrounded by the consequences of my choices. But before I face whatever comes next, I need to remember how I got here. The journey that led a once athletic teenager to this hospital bed seems impossible to trace, yet every milestone is burned into my memory. The scale didn't lie, but neither did my heart when it told me I was worth more than the number staring back at me. Time has become my enemy, but memory might be my salvation. The morphine makes everything fuzzy around the edges, but my mind is crystal clear about one thing: I need to tell this story. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever felt trapped inside their own body, suffocated by their own choices. Maybe somewhere in these memories lies the key to understanding how love can be twisted into self-destruction. The boy I once was deserves to have his voice heard, even if it comes through the broken body of the man I became. Each memory feels like a piece of a puzzle I've been too afraid to assemble. Now, facing the possibility of death, I finally have the courage to see the complete picture. If these are my final hours, then let them count for something. Let my story serve as both warning and hope, a testament to the complexity of human struggle and the possibility of redemption. The superhero I dreamed of becoming as a child never materialized, but perhaps the hero I need now is simply the man willing to tell the truth. As the medication takes hold and the world grows dim around me, I begin to remember the child who ran faster than wind. That boy feels like a stranger now, but he's the key to understanding everything that came after. The heart monitor's steady beeping reminds me that I'm still alive, still fighting, even when I don't feel strong enough to continue. Sarah's presence anchors me to this moment, to this choice between surrender and struggle. In her eyes, I see reflections of the man she fell in love with, buried beneath years of self-inflicted damage but not entirely lost. Her faith in me feels undeserved but precious, a lifeline I'm finally ready to grasp. The story I'm about to tell isn't pretty, but it's mine, and maybe that's enough. This hospital bed has become my pulpit, these machines my congregation, and this moment my final sermon. The words that come next will either be my eulogy or my resurrection, depending on whether I survive to see their impact. I've spent so many years running from truth that I'd forgotten how to walk toward it. Now, with nowhere left to run and no energy left to hide, I'm ready to face the boy I was, the man I became, and the future I might still have. The journey back through time begins now, with a heart that's failing but a spirit that refuses to quit. Every choice has led me to this moment, this reckoning with the life I've lived and the death I might face. The doctors speak in percentages and probabilities, but I know that statistics can't capture the weight of a human soul. My body may be broken, but my story isn't finished yet. In the silence between heartbeats, I find the strength to remember, to confess, and perhaps to heal. The boy who once believed he could fly is about to discover if he still has wings. The ceiling above me is white and featureless, like a blank page waiting for words. Each breath I take is both an ending and a beginning, a moment stolen from time to make meaning from chaos. Sarah's hand in mine feels like an anchor to the world of the living, a reminder that love persists even when hope falters. The machines around me mark time in electronic rhythms, but my heart keeps its own beat, steady despite everything. This is where my story truly begins, not with my birth, but with my willingness to finally tell the truth. The weight of my body presses down on this hospital bed, but the weight of my untold story feels heavier still. For 38 years, I've carried secrets, shame, and sorrow in silence, letting them compound like interest on a debt I could never repay. Now, with time running short and courage running thin, I'm ready to speak the words I should have said decades ago. The boy who dreamed of greatness never imagined it would take so much courage simply to survive. But survival, I'm learning, is its own form of heroism. In the distance, I can hear other patients, other families, other stories unfolding in rooms just like this one. We're all connected by the fragility of flesh and the resilience of spirit, united in our humanity despite our different paths. My story is unique in its details but universal in its themes: love, loss, redemption, and the endless capacity for both destruction and healing. The words that come next may be the most important I ever speak. They carry the weight of a lifetime and the hope of whatever time remains. The journey I'm about to recount began 40 years ago with a healthy baby who became a strong child, then an athletic teenager, then a broken adult lying in this bed. Each phase of my life built upon the last, creating the foundation for both my greatest victories and most devastating defeats. The boy who could outrun anyone is about to tell you how he finally learned to stop running. His story, my story, begins with golden summers and endless possibilities, when the future was a promise rather than a threat. As I close my eyes and let memory take control, I can almost feel those young legs beneath me again, strong and sure and ready for anything. The transformation from that boy to this broken man seems impossible, but every step of the journey was real, chosen, lived. Now, with death knocking at my door and love holding my hand, I'm ready to retrace those steps and find meaning in the madness. The story of Marcus Thompson begins not with this ending, but with a beginning so bright it hurt to look at directly.
We tell emotional and inspiring stories about life's toughest battles, moments of illness, struggle, recovery, love, and loss. Not every story has a happy ending, but each one carries a powerful message of strength, hope, and humanity. Subscribe to discover moving stories that touch the heart and stay with you forever.
I wasn't always this way. In fact, if you had seen me at 12 years old, you would have witnessed a different Marcus entirely, one who could run faster than any kid in our neighborhood. My legs were strong and lean, carrying me across soccer fields with the confidence of youth that knew no limits. Mom used to joke that I was made of pure energy, bouncing from one activity to another without ever seeming to tire. Those summer days felt endless, filled with bike rides that took me miles from home, swimming at the local pool until my fingers pruned, and pickup games that lasted until the streetlights came on. I was captain of my middle school soccer team, and college scouts were already taking notice of my speed and determination. The world felt like it belonged to me, and I to it. Food was simply fuel back then, nothing more complicated than that necessity every growing boy understands instinctively. I'd wolf down Mom's homemade sandwiches between practices, barely tasting them in my rush to get back outside where life was happening. Dinner was a family affair where we shared stories about our day, and I'd practically inhale whatever was on my plate before asking to be excused. The concept of emotional eating was foreign to me. When I was happy, I played. When I was sad, I played harder. My relationship with my body was pure and uncomplicated, built on trust and mutual respect that seemed unbreakable. I never questioned whether I deserved to take up space in the world. I simply existed with the natural confidence of someone who belonged. Dad and I had our best conversations during our weekend runs through the neighborhood and nearby trails. He was a marathon runner himself, lean and disciplined, and he'd slow his pace to match mine, sharing wisdom about persistence and dedication. The body achieves what the mind believes, he'd tell me as we rounded our favorite trail that wound through the local park. Those moments created a foundation of self-worth that would later crumble, but at the time, they felt unshakable as bedrock. We'd return home sweating and laughing, high-fiving over our shared accomplishment while Mom smiled from the kitchen window. She'd have fresh fruit and water waiting for us, and we'd stretch on the back porch, planning our next adventure. School came easy to me in those days, another arena where I excelled without really trying. Good grades, popularity, and athletic achievements created a perfect storm of adolescent success that made everything seem possible. Teachers praised my discipline and focus, classmates looked up to me as a natural leader, and I genuinely believed I could accomplish anything I set my mind to. The future stretched ahead like an open road, filled with possibilities I couldn't wait to explore and conquer. College scholarships seemed inevitable, professional sports felt within reach, and the idea of limitation was laughable to someone who'd never encountered real failure. I wore my confidence like armor, deflecting doubt and embracing every challenge with enthusiasm that bordered on arrogance. My bedroom walls were covered with posters of professional athletes, but they weren't just decorations, they were blueprints for my future. I studied their training routines with the intensity of a scholar, memorized their statistics like scripture, and imagined myself joining their ranks someday soon. Sleep came easily after long days of physical activity, and I'd drift off dreaming of championships and victory celebrations. Weekends meant tournaments and traveling with my team, building friendships forged in shared sweat and determination that felt permanent. The camaraderie was intoxicating, the sense of belonging absolute, and I never doubted that this brotherhood would sustain me forever. We were invincible together, unstoppable individually, and convinced that our youth would last eternally. Looking back now from this hospital bed, I realized those were the years when I learned what my body could do when I treated it with respect. Every muscle fiber was trained for purpose, every meal planned for performance, every night's rest earned through honest exhaustion that came from pushing limits. I was living proof that discipline and dedication could create something beautiful and powerful from raw potential. My body was my greatest ally, responding to every demand with loyalty and strength that never failed me. The partnership we had was sacred, built on mutual trust and shared goals that seemed achievable. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations, and mine was about to face its first real earthquake. The boy who could outrun anyone had no idea that sometimes the greatest enemy is the one you never see coming. I believed in my own invincibility with the absolute faith that only the young possess, never imagining that strength could become weakness overnight. My identity was so completely wrapped up in physical prowess that I couldn't conceive of existing without it. The mirror reflected back a body I was proud of, muscles earned through effort, skin bronzed by countless hours outdoors. I had no way of knowing that this perfect machine I'd built would soon become a prison, that the discipline I took for granted would disappear like morning mist. The foundation Dad and I had built during those weekend runs felt solid as stone. Every morning I woke up eager for whatever challenge the day might bring, confident in my ability to meet it head-on. Physical discomfort was temporary, pain was just weakness leaving the body, and obstacles were opportunities to prove my worth. I ate when I was hungry, rested when I was tired, and pushed myself when I needed to grow stronger. The simplicity of it all seems impossible now, like remembering a different species of human being entirely. My relationship with my body was based on trust, I asked it to perform, and it delivered without question or hesitation. The concept of betrayal, of my own flesh turning against me, was incomprehensible to someone who'd never experienced physical failure. Team photos from that era show a lean, confident boy with eyes bright with possibility and a smile that suggested the world was full of adventures waiting to be discovered. I stood in the center of group shots, not from ego but from natural leadership that others recognized and followed willingly. My uniform fit perfectly, my posture spoke of strength and readiness, and my expression radiated the kind of joy that comes from knowing exactly who you are. That boy in the photograph seems like a character from someone else's story now, so distant that I sometimes wonder if I dreamed him into existence. But the trophies gathering dust in Mom's attic prove he was real, that once upon a time Marcus Thompson was exactly who he appeared to be. The transformation from that golden boy to the broken man lying in this hospital bed seems impossible, like trying to trace a path from sunrise to midnight. Yet every step of that journey was real, chosen, lived through one decision at a time until the sum total became this catastrophe. The boy who believed he could fly never learned that wings can be clipped, that gravity always wins in the end, that even the strongest bodies can become prisons for the souls they once liberated. His story, my story, was about to take a turn that would test every foundation he'd built. The earthquake was coming, and I had no idea how to prepare for it. Summer before 8th grade was the last time I felt truly invincible, the final season when my body and spirit moved in perfect harmony toward goals that seemed guaranteed. I spent those long days training harder than ever, convinced that high school would bring even greater victories and recognition. The sun felt warm on my shoulders, the grass cool beneath my feet, and the future bright as the endless sky above. I had no way of knowing that autumn would bring changes that would reshape everything I thought I knew about myself. The golden years were ending, but in those final weeks of innocence, they blazed brighter than ever before. Every muscle in my young body was trained for purpose, every breath drawn in service of dreams that felt as real as the ground beneath my feet. I was Marcus Thompson, the boy who could outrun the wind, and nothing in my experience suggested that this truth could ever change. The confidence I carried wasn't arrogance, it was earned through countless hours of effort and validated by consistent results that proved my worth. My body was my temple, my ally, my greatest source of pride and joy. The idea that it might someday become my enemy was as foreign as the possibility of the sun failing to rise. Those golden years were ending, but I didn't know it yet. The last race I won that summer was a 5-kilometer fun run through downtown, and I finished nearly a full minute ahead of the second-place runner. Dad was waiting at the finish line with a medal and a smile that told me he'd never been prouder of anyone in his life. We jogged home together, cooling down in the evening air while discussing my high school training plans and the scholarships I was sure to earn. Neither of us could have imagined that within a year, everything would change forever. The boy who crossed that finish line first was about to learn that some races can't be won through speed alone. The golden years were beautiful while they lasted, but like all seasons, they had to end. 14 was the year my world shifted on its axis, though I didn't recognize the tremors at first when they began that terrible march. Dad's diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Dr. Henderson with the careful precision of someone who'd given this news too many times before. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, inoperable, words that hit our family like a freight train, derailing the life we'd built together in an instant. Within 6 months, the man who had taught me about endurance and perseverance was gone, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to swallow our house whole. Mom aged 10 years in those months of watching her husband waste away, and I watched helplessly as grief consumed the woman who had once been my anchor. Soccer practices became mechanical exercises, running felt pointless without Dad's voice encouraging me forward through the difficult stretches. The first time I turned to food for comfort, I barely noticed it happening in the haze of loss that surrounded everything. Mom had stopped cooking regular meals, surviving on coffee and crackers when she remembered to eat at all, so I started making my own decisions about what to consume. Pizza delivery became our new normal when neighbors stopped bringing casseroles, fast food filled the gaps between grief counseling sessions, and ice cream numbed the raw edges of loss in ways that talking couldn't touch. I told myself it was temporary, just until we figured out how to live without Dad's presence filling every corner of our home. But grief has its own timeline, and mine stretched longer than I ever imagined possible. Each bite offered a momentary escape from the ache in my chest, a brief respite from missing someone who would never come home again. High school started that fall, and I barely recognized myself in the mirror when I tried on my old clothes for the first day. The lean, athletic frame I'd taken for granted had begun to soften around the edges, losing definition in places where muscle used to ripple. My soccer coach noticed the change too, benching me more frequently and eventually suggesting I might be happier in a different activity altogether. The rejection stung worse than any physical injury I'd ever experienced, cutting deeper than scraped knees or pulled muscles. For the first time in my life, my body had failed me when I needed it most, betraying the trust we'd built over years of partnership. Instead of fighting back like the old Marcus would have, I retreated further into isolation, finding solace in late-night eating sessions while Mom slept fitfully down the hall. Mom tried to pull me back into the world of the living, signing me up for grief counseling and encouraging me to reconnect with my old teammates. She'd sit across from me at the kitchen table, pushing food around her plate while trying to make conversation about school and friends and activities. But I couldn't bear their pity or their awkward attempts at conversation about Dad's death, their well-meaning platitudes about time healing wounds. Food became my counselor, my teammate, my most reliable friend in a world that suddenly felt hostile and unpredictable. It never asked uncomfortable questions or offered empty comfort about Dad being in a better place now. A bag of chips didn't expect me to be strong, a chocolate bar didn't judge me for crying alone in my room at night. The weight crept on gradually at first, 5 pounds, then 10, then 20, each milestone barely noticeable until I stepped on the scale Mom had hidden in her closet. Each new number felt both shameful and oddly satisfying, as if I were building a fortress around my heart to protect it from further damage. When people commented on my changing appearance, I brushed off their concerns with jokes or anger, depending on my mood and their persistence. Deep down, I knew I was hurting myself, but the alternative, feeling everything fully without the buffer of excess food, seemed impossible to bear. The boy who once ran toward challenges was now running away from life itself, and food was his method of escape. Each meal became a small rebellion against the pain that threatened to overwhelm me completely. By the end of my sophomore year, I had gained 60 pounds and lost most of my friends to discomfort and distance. The athletic scholarships I'd once dreamed of were no longer even a distant possibility, and college recruiters who had once called regularly stopped returning our messages. Mom and I existed in parallel worlds of grief, each dealing with our loss in our own destructive way while tiptoeing around each other's pain. I convinced myself that this was just a phase, that someday I'd snap out of it and return to being the person I used to be. But habits have a way of becoming identity, and the identity I was creating was one of defeat, isolation, and surrender. The foundation Dad and I had built during those weekend runs was crumbling, and I lacked the tools to rebuild it on my own. Food became my language for emotions I couldn't express in words, a vocabulary of comfort that spoke directly to my wounded soul. When I missed Dad, I ate his favorite cookies until the memory felt bearable. When I felt guilty about failing at soccer, I consumed entire pizzas to punish myself for letting everyone down. When loneliness threatened to crush me, I surrounded myself with snacks that would keep me company through the long, empty hours. Each bite was a conversation with feelings too big and too scary to face directly, a way of processing pain that felt safer than talking to counselors or friends. The ritual of eating became sacred, the one activity that still brought me something resembling peace in a world that had become chaotic and unpredictable. My reflection in mirrors began to show a stranger, someone whose face I recognized but whose body belonged to someone else entirely. The athletic confidence that had once defined me was replaced by hunched shoulders and averted eyes, the posture of someone who'd rather remain invisible than risk judgment. Clothes shopping became an exercise in denial, buying larger sizes while telling myself they were just cut smaller than they used to be. Teachers who had once praised my leadership now spoke to me with the careful tone reserved for troubled students, their expectations clearly lowered. The gap between who I used to be and who I was becoming felt insurmountable, a chasm that widened with every pound gained and every opportunity lost. Sleep became another casualty of my transformation, disrupted by blood sugar spikes and crashes that left me exhausted but unable to rest peacefully. I'd lie awake thinking about Dad, replaying our conversations and wondering what advice he'd give me if he could see what I'd become. The shame of disappointing his memory felt heavier than all the physical weight I'd gained combined. His voice in my head grew quieter as the months passed, replaced by my own inner critic that cataloged every failure and predicted every future disappointment. The boy who had once felt invincible now felt weak in every possible way, trapped in a body that no longer obeyed his commands. Yearbook photos from those years tell the story more clearly than any words could capture, showing the gradual transformation from confident athlete to isolated teenager. Each school picture revealed more weight gained, more spark lost from eyes that had once blazed with ambition and joy. I started avoiding cameras whenever possible, declining invitations to events where photos might be taken and memories might be preserved. The contrast between my 8th grade soccer team photo and my junior class picture was so stark it looked like two different people entirely. That healthy, happy boy seemed to be disappearing more completely with each passing month, replaced by someone I didn't recognize or particularly like. The worst part was the growing realization that Dad wouldn't recognize me either if he could somehow return and see what I'd become. The son he'd been so proud of, the boy he trained on those morning runs, had been replaced by someone who couldn't run to the mailbox without getting winded. I'd taken everything he'd taught me about discipline and perseverance and thrown it away for the temporary comfort of food that solved nothing and created new problems daily. His memory deserved better than this, but I felt powerless to honor it in any meaningful way. The foundation we built together was gone, and I had no idea how to reconstruct it alone. By graduation, I weighed over 200 pounds for the first time in my life, and the cap and gown did little to hide the truth about what I'd become. Mom cried at the ceremony, but I suspected it wasn't entirely from pride at my achievement of simply finishing high school. The diploma in my hand felt hollow, a participation trophy for merely surviving 4 years of academic mediocrity and personal destruction. My classmates were making plans for college, careers, and adventures, while I was already planning how to hide from the world that no longer seemed to have a place for me. The boy who once believed he could conquer anything had become a young man afraid to be seen by anyone. The transformation from golden boy to broken teenager had taken less than 4 years, but it felt like a lifetime of wrong choices and missed opportunities. Each decision to eat rather than feel, to isolate rather than connect, to give up rather than fight back, had led me further from the person I used to be. The path back seemed impossible to find, obscured by shame and overgrown with habits that had taken root in the fertile soil of grief. I had no way of knowing that this was still just the beginning of my journey away from health and toward the hospital bed where I now lie, reflecting on the boy I used to be and mourning his loss as deeply as I mourned my father's death. College was supposed to be my fresh start, my chance to reinvent myself away from the shadows of grief that haunted our house like unwelcome guests. Instead, it became the place where my relationship with food transformed from comfort-seeking into something far more dangerous, a full-scale addiction that would define the next decade of my life. The dining hall offered unlimited access to every type of food imaginable, and I took advantage with the enthusiasm of someone finally freed from all restrictions and parental oversight. Breakfast became multiple plates of pancakes and bacon, lunch expanded into afternoon-long affairs with multiple trips through the serving lines, and dinner was just the beginning of night-long eating marathons in my dorm room. My roommate, a pre-med student named Jake, watched with growing concern as boxes of cookies and bags of chips accumulated around my desk like supplies for a siege. The freedom I'd craved for years turned out to be the rope I'd use to hang myself with, metaphorically speaking. The freshman 15 became the freshman 50, then kept climbing like a rocket headed for disaster, unstoppable and increasingly dangerous. By Christmas break, I needed new clothes in sizes I'd never imagined wearing, numbers that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Mom barely recognized me when I walked through our front door, and I could see the shock and guilt warring in her eyes like competing armies. She blamed herself for not being more present during my senior year of high school, for letting grief consume her while I was clearly drowning too. We spent the holidays in a careful dance around the obvious, both of us pretending that my transformation was temporary and reversible. But when I returned to campus in January, I brought with me a suitcase full of larger clothes and a determination to avoid mirrors at all costs. Academic performance became another casualty of my expanding waistline, collateral damage in a war I was losing on multiple fronts simultaneously. Concentration was difficult when my blood sugar was constantly fluctuating between sugar highs that left me jittery and crashes that made me want to sleep. I'd fall asleep in lectures, skip classes when I felt too self-conscious about squeezing into the desk chairs, and eventually stopped going to the campus gym altogether. The few friends I'd made during orientation gradually drifted away as I became increasingly isolated and defensive about my appearance and eating habits. Social events felt like minefields where I might encounter judgment or unwanted advice about my lifestyle choices from people who couldn't possibly understand. Food remained my most reliable companion, never disappointing me or making me feel inadequate about who I was becoming. My major in business administration felt increasingly meaningless as my self-worth plummeted along with my GPA and social connections. Why plan for a future when I couldn't even control my present circumstances or basic daily decisions? Job interviews seemed like impossible hurdles when I could barely fit into professional clothing from normal stores. The dreams I'd once harbored about success and achievement felt like jokes told by a different person, someone I could barely remember being anymore. Each semester brought new low points, chairs that wouldn't accommodate my size, professors who seemed to look right through me, and a growing sense that I was invisible to everyone except the pizza delivery drivers who knew my order by heart. My world was shrinking even as my body was expanding, creating a prison of my own making. Dating was completely out of the question, a realm of human experience that felt as foreign as space travel or deep-sea exploration. The few times I'd attempted to talk to women, I could see the discomfort in their eyes, the way they searched for polite excuses to end our conversations. I told myself I wasn't interested in relationships anyway, that I was too focused on my studies to bother with romance or social connections. But late at night, when the dining hall was closed and I was alone with my emergency stash of snacks, I'd admit to myself that I was terrified of rejection. Food never rejected me, it never made me feel like I wasn't good enough exactly as I was, broken and struggling. The companionship of a candy bar was predictable and reliable in ways that human relationships could never be for someone like me. By graduation, I weighed 280 pounds and felt like a stranger inhabiting someone else's life, watching from the inside as this person who looked like me made one destructive choice after another. Mom cried when she saw me walk across that stage, and I knew it wasn't just from pride in my achievement of completing 4 years of college. The diploma in my hand felt hollow, a participation trophy for merely surviving 4 years of academic mediocrity and personal destruction. My classmates were making plans for careers, relationships, and adventures, while I was already planning how to order groceries online to avoid the judgment of checkout clerks and other customers. The boy who once believed he could conquer the world had become a man afraid to be seen by it, hiding behind layers of flesh and shame that seemed impossible to shed. The transformation from grieving teenager to morbidly obese college graduate had happened gradually, one meal at a time, 1 pound at a time, until the sum total became this disaster. I'd created my own personal hell and furnished it with all-you-can-eat buffets and late-night food delivery services. The mirror in my dorm room reflected back a person I didn't recognize and didn't particularly like, someone whose story seemed to be writing itself toward a tragic ending. My body had become both my prison and my captor, holding me hostage to desires I couldn't control and habits I couldn't break. The boy who had once run like the wind now got winded walking up a single flight of stairs to his dorm room. Each meal had become a conversation with emotions I couldn't process any other way, a vocabulary of comfort that spoke directly to wounds that refused to heal. When I felt lonely, I ate until the feeling was buried under layers of temporary satisfaction. When I felt guilty about my appearance, I ate to punish myself for being weak and undisciplined. When I felt hopeful about making changes, I ate to celebrate the possibility before it could disappoint me again. Food had become my drug of choice, my coping mechanism, my closest relationship, and my most reliable source of comfort in a world that felt hostile and judgmental. The ritual of eating had replaced all other forms of self-care and emotional regulation in my life. The distance between the person I used to be and the person I'd become felt insurmountable, like trying to bridge an ocean with a single step. Every choice had led me further away from health and closer to this disaster, creating a momentum that felt impossible to reverse. The boy who had once felt invincible now felt like he was drowning in his own flesh, suffocating under the weight of choices that had seemed so small at the time. College was ending, and real life was beginning, but I had no idea how to function in a world that wasn't designed for someone like me. The spiral was continuing downward, and I couldn't see the bottom yet. My parents' investment in my education felt wasted on someone who had squandered every opportunity for growth and self-improvement during those 4 crucial years. Instead of emerging from college stronger, smarter, and more capable, I was leaving more broken than when I'd arrived. The potential that teachers and coaches had once seen in me seemed like a cruel joke now, a promise that had been broken by my own hand. The future that had once seemed so bright and full of possibilities now looked dark and limited, constrained by the physical and emotional boundaries I'd created for myself. The downward spiral was accelerating, and I was running out of ways to pretend everything was fine. The boy who had once believed he could fly had forgotten how to walk without getting winded, forgotten how to dream without feeling foolish, forgotten how to hope without feeling naive. College graduation should have been a beginning, but it felt more like an ending, the final burial of the person I used to be under layers of flesh and shame that seemed permanent. The world was full of opportunities for someone else, someone better, someone who hadn't given up on themselves so completely. I was 22 years old and already felt like my life was over, like the best parts of my story had ended in high school and everything since had been a slow descent into irrelevance. The diploma I'd earned felt meaningless in my hands, a piece of paper that couldn't change the fundamental reality of what I'd become during those 4 years of self-destruction. My classmates were celebrating their achievements and planning their futures, while I was calculating how quickly I could get home to the safety of my childhood bedroom and the familiar comfort of my mother's kitchen. The boy who had once run toward challenges was still running, but now he was running away from everything: responsibility, opportunity, health, happiness, and hope. The spiral was tightening, and I was running out of time to change course before it became a permanent trap. My first job out of college was at a mid-sized accounting firm downtown, where I discovered that the professional world was not designed for someone of my size and limitations. The office chairs were too narrow, creating daily humiliation as I tried to squeeze into spaces clearly designed for average-sized people. The conference room seating was a nightmare I faced multiple times per week, and business lunches became exercises in choosing the least embarrassing options from restaurant menus while pretending I wasn't self-conscious. My supervisor, Mr. Patterson, was a thin, energetic man who seemed genuinely puzzled by my lack of ambition and frequent absences due to what I vaguely termed health issues. Within 6 months, I was relegated to back-office work, processing paperwork and avoiding client meetings whenever possible. The isolation suited me fine, or so I told myself as I ate lunch alone at my desk every single day, surrounded by spreadsheets and self-imposed exile. Dating attempts during my mid-20s were disasters that I've spent years trying to forget, each one more humiliating than the last. Online dating profiles became exercises in creative photography, angling shots to hide my true size while desperately hoping that personality could somehow overcome physical reality when we met. The few dates I managed to secure ended in awkward conversations over coffee, where I could practically see my dates' disappointment settling in as they realized the extent of my deception about my appearance. One woman, Rebecca, actually got up and left after 10 minutes, claiming she'd forgotten an important appointment that couldn't wait. The rejection cut deeper than I expected, sending me home to a pint of ice cream and a pizza large enough to feed a family of 4. Each failed attempt at romance reinforced my belief that I was unlovable, undesirable, and destined to spend my life alone with only food for companionship. Sleep became my enemy during those years. What had once been peaceful rest transformed into a nightly battle with my own body's betrayal. What started as occasional snoring evolved into full-blown sleep apnea, leaving me exhausted despite spending 10 hours in bed each night. My doctor prescribed a CPAP machine, but the mask felt like a symbol of my failure, a mechanical reminder that my body could no longer perform its most basic functions without assistance. Mornings were brutal affairs of hitting snooze buttons and dragging myself through fog-thick fatigue to jobs that felt increasingly pointless. Energy drinks and coffee became necessary just to maintain consciousness, while sugar crashes in the afternoon sent me searching for candy bars and donuts to function. The cycle was exhausting and demoralizing, but I felt powerless to break it without addressing the root cause I wasn't ready to face. The doctor visits became more frequent and more frightening as my body began to rebel against years of abuse and neglect. Blood pressure medication joined the growing collection of pills on my nightstand, a pharmaceutical arsenal against the war I was waging on myself. Prediabetes became full-blown type 2, requiring insulin injections that I administered with the same mechanical efficiency I brought to everything else in my life. Each new diagnosis felt like another door closing, another limitation on an already constrained existence that seemed to shrink with every medical appointment. My physician, Dr. Martinez, spoke carefully about lifestyle changes and surgical options, but his words felt like suggestions for someone else. Some hypothetical person with more willpower and self-control than I possessed would follow his advice and turn their life around. My weight crossed 350 pounds around my 30th birthday, a milestone I marked alone in my apartment with a cake large enough for a party I'd never throw. Mom had moved to Arizona by then, claiming the dry climate would help her arthritis, but I suspected she needed distance from the daily reminder of how thoroughly her son had destroyed himself. Our weekly phone calls were exercises in careful conversation, both of us avoiding the obvious topics while pretending everything was fine and normal. She'd ask about work and friends I didn't have, while I'd inquire about her health and social activities that sounded enviable from my perspective. The distance between us felt like more than just geography, it was the space between the son she'd raised and the man I'd become. The mirror in my bathroom became my most honest critic, reflecting back a person I no longer recognized as myself from any angle. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of the boy I used to be in old photos, and the contrast was so stark it felt like looking at a different person entirely. That athletic teenager might as well have been a character from a movie for all the connection I felt to him now. The man staring back at me from the glass was a stranger, someone whose story I was living but didn't understand or particularly like. Food remained my constant companion through it all, the one relationship that never demanded more than I was willing to give. It never asked me to change, to grow, to become better than I was in any given moment. Work became another source of shame as my size made even basic office functions difficult and embarrassing to navigate daily. Bathroom stalls were too narrow, elevator weight limits became a concern, and office parties were minefields of judgment disguised as social events. My productivity suffered as my health declined, and I could see my colleagues' patience wearing thin with my limitations and frequent sick days. The career advancement I'd once dreamed of seemed laughable now, reserved for people who could fit into business suits and inspire confidence rather than concern. I was earning enough to survive, but survival had become the ceiling of my ambitions rather than the floor. The boy who had once dreamed of success now measured achievement by making it through another day without complete humiliation. Grocery shopping became a strategic military operation requiring careful planning to avoid peak hours and judgmental stares from other customers. I'd fill my cart with frozen dinners, snack foods, and ice cream while avoiding eye contact with anyone who might be calculating the connection between my purchases and my appearance. Self-checkout lanes became my salvation, eliminating the need to face a cashier's expression of pity or disgust as they processed my weekly haul of processed foods. Late-night convenience store runs became common when I ran out of supplies but couldn't bear the thought of daylight shopping expeditions. Food delivery services were a godsend, allowing me to maintain my habits while avoiding the judgment of the outside world that felt increasingly hostile. Social isolation became both my choice and my prison, a protective barrier that also kept me trapped in cycles of destructive behavior. Old friends stopped calling after enough declined invitations and awkward conversations about my changed circumstances and appearance. New friendships felt impossible when I was so ashamed of who I'd become and what my life had shrunk to accommodate. Weekends stretched endlessly ahead, filled with nothing but television, internet browsing, and meal planning that revolved around comfort rather than nutrition. The loneliness was crushing, but the alternative, putting myself out there for potential rejection, seemed worse than voluntary isolation. I'd created my own prison and appointed myself as both guard and prisoner, serving a sentence I'd imposed on myself. My apartment became a cave where I hibernated from a world that seemed designed for people unlike me in every possible way. Furniture groaned under my weight, doorways felt narrower than they should be, and stairs became mountains that left me breathless and sweating. I ordered everything online: groceries, clothes, entertainment, creating a bubble where I could exist without confronting the reality of my situation or the judgment of strangers. The outside world felt hostile and unwelcoming, full of people who would stare, whisper, or make assumptions about my character based on my appearance. My cave was safe, predictable, and stocked with all the comfort foods that had brought me to this point but couldn't seem to carry me beyond it. The distance between the person I used to be and the person I'd become felt like an unbridgeable chasm, growing wider with each passing year and each gained pound. Every old photo, every memory of athletic achievement, every reminder of dreams I'd once pursued felt like evidence of a life that had belonged to someone else entirely. The transformation seemed irreversible, a one-way journey toward isolation, illness, and early death that I was powerless to stop despite knowing exactly where it led. The boy who had once believed he could accomplish anything had become a man convinced he was capable of nothing except consuming and surviving, day after day, without purpose or hope for meaningful change. The worst part was the growing realization that I was becoming exactly the kind of person I used to judge, someone who had let themselves go beyond recognition or redemption. The irony wasn't lost on me that the boy who had once prided himself on discipline and self-control had become the poster child for weakness and surrender to base impulses. Every meal felt like both a small suicide and a temporary resurrection, killing my hopes while keeping my body alive for another day of the same destructive patterns. I was trapped in a body that felt foreign and hostile, imprisoned by habits that served no purpose except to maintain the status quo of slow-motion self-destruction. My 30s loomed ahead like a death sentence, promising more of the same decline and deterioration I'd been experiencing throughout my 20s without hope for reversal. The future had once been full of possibilities, now it felt like a narrow tunnel leading toward inevitable medical complications, social isolation, and premature death. I was sleepwalking through a life that bore no resemblance to any of the dreams I'd once harbored, existing rather than living, surviving rather than thriving. The boy who had once run toward the future was now trudging toward it with dread, carrying the weight of poor choices and missed opportunities that seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. The man I'd become was a cautionary tale, a living example of what happens when grief goes unprocessed and pain gets medicated with food rather than addressed through healthier means. But I was too deep in the hole to see a way out, too heavy to climb toward light, too ashamed to ask for help from anyone who might be willing to offer it. The adult consequences of my choices were mounting daily, and I lacked the tools, motivation, or hope necessary to change course before it was too late to matter. The spiral was tightening, and I was running out of time to find a different ending to this tragic story I was writing with my life. Sarah entered my life like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, completely unexpected and impossible to ignore when she smiled at my awkward attempts at humor. We met at the public library where she worked as a research librarian, and I'd been coming in regularly to use their computers when mine crashed and I couldn't afford repairs. She was helping me navigate a particularly frustrating database when she laughed at one of my self-deprecating jokes, and something in that sound made me look up from the screen to really see her for the first time. Her smile was genuine, reaching all the way to her hazel eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone was actually seeing me rather than looking past me. She treated me like a human being worthy of attention and kindness, a revolutionary concept in my world of self-imposed isolation. The conversation flowed naturally, and I found myself remembering what it felt like to connect with another person without shame or pretense getting in the way. Our friendship developed slowly over weeks of library visits that became less about computer access and more about conversation with this remarkable woman. Sarah had a way of asking questions that made me remember pieces of myself I'd forgotten existed, my love of reading, my encyclopedic knowledge of sports statistics, even my dreams of travel that I'd abandoned along with so many other things. She never mentioned my weight directly, but she also never seemed uncomfortable around me the way most people did when confronted with my size. When she suggested we grab coffee after her shift one evening, I almost said no out of habit and self-protection, but something in her expression convinced me to take the risk. That first real date lasted 4 hours, and I drove home feeling like I'd awakened from a long, dreamless sleep into a world full of possibility I'd forgotten could exist for someone like me. Sarah's acceptance of me was both healing and terrifying, challenging everything I believed about my own worthiness of love and companionship. She seemed genuinely attracted to me, expressing affection through touch and words in ways that challenged everything I believed about my own desirability as a romantic partner. When she first said she loved me, 6 months into our relationship, I actually argued with her about it, insisting she was mistaken or settling for less than she deserved. Her patience with my self-doubt was extraordinary, but I could see the way my negative self-talk hurt her feelings and made her question her own judgment. She began to understand that my relationship with food was more complicated than simple lack of willpower, and she tried to help in ways that were loving but sometimes felt like surveillance. Grocery shopping together became tense affairs where I felt judged for every item that went into our cart, even though her intentions were pure. Marriage at 34 felt like the most unlikely miracle of my life, a gift I didn't deserve but couldn't bring myself to refuse. Sarah looked radiant in her wedding dress, while I felt like an imposter in a tuxedo that required multiple alterations to accommodate my 380-pound frame and still looked awkward on my massive body. The photographer worked overtime to find angles that would make me look less enormous next to my bride, and I spent our reception worrying that I was embarrassing her in front of her family and friends. But when we danced our first dance, she whispered in my ear that I was her hero, and for 3 minutes and 27 seconds, I almost believed her. The honeymoon in Hawaii was marred by my inability to fit into airplane seats comfortably and my constant anxiety about being judged by other tourists, but Sarah's joy was infectious enough to carry us both through the awkward moments that punctuated our celebration. Living with someone who loved me forced me to confront the reality of my eating patterns in ways I'd successfully avoided for years of solitary existence. Sarah would find evidence of my secret binges, empty containers hidden in my home office, fast food wrappers stuffed into my car's glove compartment, charges on our credit card statements for restaurants I claimed never to visit. She tried everything from gentle encouragement to tearful interventions, but my addiction was stronger than her love, though I hated admitting that even to myself. We'd have long conversations where I'd promise to do better, to get help, to try harder, but within days I'd be back to my old patterns. Sneaking food like a teenager, hiding contraband, lying about what I'd eaten during the day, making excuses for why I couldn't commit to the diet plan she'd researched with such hope and dedication. The worst part was watching the hope fade from Sarah's eyes as year after year passed without meaningful change on my part. She'd research diets and support groups, leave articles about weight loss surgery on my nightstand, and suggest couples counseling that I always found excuses to avoid attending. I could see her calculating in quiet moments, wondering if this was the life she wanted, if she'd signed up to be a widow before 40 because of my self-destructive choices. When she started talking about wanting children, I panicked, knowing that my current trajectory would likely make me unable to be the kind of father a child deserved to have. The guilt of potentially denying her motherhood because of my own failures was almost unbearable, but still not enough to overcome the pull of food. Food had become my primary coping mechanism for everything, including the guilt itself, creating a vicious cycle that seemed impossible to break. Our marriage became a careful dance around the obvious, both of us pretending that love could somehow overcome the physical reality of my continued decline and deterioration. Sarah would cook healthy meals that I'd eat dutifully at dinner, then supplement with secret snacks throughout the evening when she wasn't watching. She'd suggest activities we could do together, walks in the park, swimming at the community center, bike rides through our neighborhood, but I always had excuses about work, weather, or energy levels that were code for my embarrassment about my physical limitations. Intimacy became complicated by my size and my shame, leaving both of us frustrated and disconnected despite our deep emotional bond and genuine love for each other. I could see her loneliness growing even though we shared the same house, the same bed, the same last name that couldn't bridge the gap my choices had created. The mirror in our bedroom reflected back a couple where one person glowed with health and vitality while the other seemed to be slowly disappearing into his own flesh. Sarah maintained her figure through regular exercise and mindful eating, while I continued to expand like a balloon that might pop at any moment under the pressure. The contrast between us in photographs was becoming more stark with each passing year, and I started avoiding cameras whenever possible to spare us both the embarrassment. She never complained directly about my appearance, but I could see her wince when she had to help me with tasks that should have been simple, tying my shoes, getting up from low chairs, climbing stairs without becoming winded. Her love was constant, but my shame was growing stronger than her devotion, creating distance even when we were physically close. Friends and family began to express concern about my health in ways that were impossible to ignore or deflect with humor anymore. Sarah's parents would ask pointed questions about my latest doctor visits, her siblings would suggest activities that were clearly designed to get me moving, and even strangers felt entitled to comment on my size or offer unsolicited advice about weight loss. Each intervention felt like an attack on my dignity, reinforcing my belief that I was a burden to everyone around me who cared enough to worry. Sarah would defend me fiercely in public, then cry privately about her frustration with my continued self-destruction despite her unwavering support and the resources we had to address the problem. I was breaking her heart daily while breaking my own body slowly, trapped in patterns that served no one and helped nothing. The love we shared was real and deep, but it was being tested by the reality of living with someone who was slowly committing suicide with a knife and fork. Sarah's friends would tell her she deserved better, that she was enabling my destructive behavior by staying and supporting me through the consequences of my choices. I agreed with them completely but lacked the courage to set her free to find the healthy partner she deserved instead of the broken man she'd married out of love and hope. Every day I stayed married to her felt like another day I was stealing from the life she could have had with someone capable of being a true partner rather than a burden disguised as a husband. The guilt was crushing, but not enough to motivate the change that seemed increasingly impossible as the years passed and the weight continued to climb. My love for Sarah was the purest thing in my life, but it was being poisoned by my inability to love myself enough to fight for the future we both wanted. She deserved a husband who could chase their future children around the backyard, who could travel the world with her, who could grow old beside her rather than dying young from preventable complications. Instead, she got a man who was aging rapidly, declining daily, and running out of time to become the partner she'd married believing I could be. The tragedy wasn't just that I was killing myself, it was that I was taking her dreams down with me, 1 pound at a time, one missed opportunity at a time, one broken promise to change at a time. The woman who had saved me from complete isolation was now trapped in a marriage to someone who couldn't save himself, no matter how much love surrounded him or how many chances he was given to choose differently. Sarah's love was the greatest gift I'd ever received, and I was squandering it daily through choices that made no sense to anyone, including myself. The boy who had once believed in happy endings was learning that love alone isn't enough to overcome the momentum of self-destruction that has been building for decades. But her presence in my life was still the closest thing to grace I'd ever experienced, even as I continued to prove myself unworthy of it through actions that spoke louder than any promises I could make. The heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 24 years after Dad's cancer diagnosis, a cosmic coincidence that wasn't lost on me even through the crushing pain. I was reaching for a donut in the break room when the agony hit my chest like a sledgehammer, radiating down my left arm with an intensity that dropped me to my knees on the cold linoleum floor. Through the crushing pressure that felt like an elephant sitting on my chest, I could hear my coworkers calling 911, their voices sounding distant and muffled as if they were speaking through water while I gasped for air. Sarah's face when she arrived at the emergency room will haunt me forever, a mixture of terror and resignation that told me she'd been expecting this call for years, rehearsing this moment in her nightmares. The paramedics had struggled to lift me onto the stretcher, and I knew that my weight had made their job harder, just as it had made everything else in my life more complicated and dangerous than it needed to be. 3 days later, lying in this hospital bed connected to machines that beep and were around me like a mechanical chorus, I finally understood what Dr. Martinez had been trying to tell me for years about the trajectory I was on. My body was shutting down, overwhelmed by the stress I'd placed on it through decades of abuse disguised as comfort and self-medication. The diabetes had damaged my kidneys beyond repair, the sleep apnea had strained my heart to its breaking point, and the excess weight had created a cascade of problems that surgery couldn't fix and medication couldn't fully control anymore. At 420 pounds and 38 years old, I had created the perfect storm of medical complications that would likely kill me before my 40th birthday unless something drastic changed immediately. The boy who once ran like the wind now struggled to walk from his bed to the bathroom without assistance, gasping for air after the slightest exertion. Sarah and I had the conversation I'd been dreading for our entire marriage on that third night, when the nurses dimmed the lights and left us alone with the truth neither of us had wanted to speak aloud before now. She held my swollen hand and cried as she told me about the life insurance policy she'd increased without telling me, about the will she'd asked me to update months ago, about the children we'd never have because she couldn't bear to be a single mother so young. But she also talked about the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who made her laugh in that library years ago, and she promised me that version of Marcus still existed somewhere beneath all the pain and fear and self-destruction that had accumulated over the years. Her forgiveness felt like grace I didn't deserve, but I accepted it anyway because I finally understood that grace isn't earned through good behavior, it's given freely by those who choose to love us despite our failures and shortcomings. The surgeon explained my options with the gentle honesty of someone who delivered similar news many times before to patients and families facing the same crossroads. Gastric bypass surgery offered hope but carried enormous risks for someone in my deteriorated condition, with success rates that weren't encouraging given my current state of health. Without intervention, I might have months, possibly a year if I was very lucky and nothing else went wrong with my failing systems. With surgery, I might survive to see 50, assuming I could commit to the dramatic lifestyle changes that would be required afterward for the rest of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same determination I'd once brought to athletic training would now be necessary just to keep me alive past middle age. Sarah squeezed my hand as I told Dr. Patel to schedule the surgery, knowing that this decision would determine whether our love story ended here in this hospital room or continued into an uncertain but possible future. Recovery was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated, even after all the warnings and preparation the medical team had provided beforehand. The physical pain was manageable with medication, but the psychological adjustment felt like learning to live in someone else's body after decades of familiarity with my own limitations. Food could no longer serve as comfort, celebration, or escape. It became purely functional, measured in tiny portions that seemed laughably small compared to the quantities I was used to consuming daily. Sarah attended every support group meeting with me, taking notes and asking questions while I struggled to speak honestly about the addiction that had nearly killed me and was still fighting for control every single day. Slowly, week by week, I began to lose weight and regain pieces of myself I'd thought were gone forever, buried under years of poor choices and self-neglect. Now, 6 months after surgery and 120 pounds lighter, I can walk up a flight of stairs without gasping for breath like I'm climbing Mount Everest. My diabetes is controlled with diet and minimal medication for the first time in over a decade, my sleep apnea has improved dramatically, and my blood pressure is normal for the first time in 15 years. Sarah and I are talking about children again, cautiously but with genuine hope for the first time since our wedding day, and I've started running short distances on the treadmill at our local gym. The road ahead is long and uncertain, marked by daily choices that will determine whether I continue to heal or slip back into old patterns that nearly destroyed everything I care about. But for the first time since Dad died, I believe I have a future worth fighting for, a story that might end with redemption rather than tragedy. The boy who dreamed of being invincible learned that true strength comes from admitting weakness and asking for help when you need it most. If you're reading this and seeing yourself in my journey, please know that it's never too late to change course, though it's always easier than you think it will be and harder than you want it to be at the same time. The boy who dreamed of being a superhero learned that sometimes the greatest act of heroism is saving yourself, not from external villains but from the internal voices that tell you you're not worth saving. Love, both giving it and accepting it, requires courage that goes deeper than any physical strength I ever possessed as a young athlete. Sarah saved my life by loving me enough to stand by me through my worst moments, but ultimately, I had to choose to save myself from the prison I'd created. That choice, made daily in small acts of self-care and commitment, is the only real power any of us have over our own stories ending, and it's never too late to start writing a different conclusion. The transformation from the broken man who nearly died in this hospital bed to someone with hope for the future wasn't magic or luck, it was work, daily work, supported by love and professional help and a commitment to honoring the life I'd been given. The mirror now shows someone I'm beginning to recognize again, not the athletic teenager I used to be, but someone who might become worthy of the love he's received and the second chance he's been given. Food is no longer my enemy or my friend, it's simply fuel for a body I'm learning to respect again, one meal at a time, one choice at a time, one day at a time. The boy who once ran toward his dreams got lost for 26 years, but he's finding his way back to the light, supported by hands that refuse to let him fall completely into the darkness he'd created for himself. My story isn't finished yet, and neither is yours if you're struggling with the same demons that nearly destroyed me completely. The path back to health and happiness isn't straight or easy, but it's possible with the right support and the willingness to do whatever it takes to reclaim your life from the habits that are stealing it from you. Sarah and I are planning our first real vacation in years, to places I couldn't have traveled to at my heaviest weight, and I'm finally allowing myself to believe we might have decades together instead of just months. The boy who believed he could fly is learning that sometimes falling is part of the journey, and getting back up is the real test of character and strength. The machines around me have been replaced by hope, the medical crisis has become a medical miracle, and the ending I was so sure would be tragic has become the beginning of a story worth telling and worth living. If these words reach someone who needs to hear them, someone who's drowning in their own choices and can't see a way back to the surface, then every ounce of pain and shame I've experienced will have served a purpose greater than myself. The boy who dreamed of being a hero finally became one, not by saving the world, but by saving himself and showing others that redemption is possible no matter how far you've fallen from grace. The future is unwritten, and every day we get to choose whether we're writing a tragedy or a comeback story with our lives. Love saved me, but only after I decided I was worth saving, and that decision changed everything that came after it in ways I'm still discovering each day. The boy who could outrun the wind learned that sometimes the greatest race is the one you run against your own worst impulses, and sometimes the greatest victory is simply choosing to keep running when everything in you wants to quit. My story continues beyond these hospital walls, beyond this moment of reckoning, into a future bright with possibility I thought I'd lost forever but was really just waiting for me to be brave enough to claim it once more. The heart that nearly stopped beating is now strong enough to love fully, to dream boldly, and to run toward a future that includes growing old with Sarah, raising children who will never know the broken man I used to be, and becoming the person that boy who ran like the wind always had the potential to become. This is my story, but it doesn't have to be your ending. Change is possible, hope is real, and love can conquer even the darkest chapters if you're willing to write a different conclusion to the story you're living every single day.